Hello, and welcome to the Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. My name is Ryan, and I am a self-proclaimed Calvin and Hobbes superfan and expert.
And my name is also Ryan, although most people call me Indy.
Hello, and welcome back to the Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. Now, Calvin and Hobbes is a comic strip, of course, and today we're talking about a related medium that also factors into the strip a fair amount, and that's comic books. Now, before we get into that, though, just our usual disclaimers. We are not affiliated with Bill Watterson or his syndicate, so we won't be able to show you examples of the comics that we talk about. However, we're going to make detailed references in a blog post, which will give you where you can find every strip we talk about in the released books and where you can find them on gocomics.com if you have a subscription to that. So you'll be able to follow along. And especially if you have the books themselves, feel free to follow along as we talk about them.
Yeah, now before we get into the episode, we have an email that we need to address. So this one comes from Elliot, who's emailed us a couple of times before. And Elliot says, first, he liked the camping episode, and it made him think of something that isn't exactly Calvin and Hobbes, but is a camping strip by Bill Watterson. So
Oh,
you can find this in the complete Calvin and Hobbes. It's one of the early submissions before we got the product that we have now. He says there's an early strip where Calvin had the long hair that goes over his eyes, and he asks if that's Marvin, the proto Calvin. And so the answer to that is actually a little complicated. I emailed him back, but just for everyone else's edification, Marvin did look like that. So originally, Calvin was named Marvin, and he didn't have the spiky hair. He had the mop of hair that covered his eyes, like we've talked about before. Apparently, his name changed to Calvin before his hair changed to spiky because in the complete Calvin and Hobbes, in this strip, Hobbes refers to him as Calvin. So, yes, that is what Marvin looked like, but in this instance, no, it's not Marvin, it's now Calvin. So,
I guess we'd call him Carvin.
yeah. So now that we're all thoroughly confused, but anyway, so it's a camping strip. So the now Calvin and Hobbes are in scouts or something, and among other things that happen, Hobbes gambles their food away to some woodland creatures, and there's some other scouts in there. But anyway, so that's another example of camping that's not directly part of Calvin and Hobbes, but kind of ties into how important camping would be in the strip.
Okay, so we have proto Calvin and what we might think of as proto Hobbes too, because our, we'll say, official Hobbes or the developed Hobbes. I don't know if he would ever be willing to risk gambling food. That seems like something he wouldn't want to take a chance on.
Yeah, I think that's not quite the Hobbes we have today. So yeah, I think you're right. And Elliot mentions one more thing. So he talks about how in the Christmas episode we said that Calvin tries to get more presents by writing to Santa as his own younger brother Melville. And
Melville, yes.
yes, which we've wondered may be connected to Herman Melville. Elliot also wonders if this could be connected, kind of an Easter egg connecting to Marvin. I mean, Marvin Melville, both starting with M, just kind of a potential throwback there. And, obviously I have no idea if that's true, but it could be.
Yeah, possible.
Yeah. So, oh, and he says that he's excited for us to talk about Calvin going to school. I don't want to spoil too much, but obviously we will have a school episode. So that's coming.
Yes. Yeah, so thanks for the interesting comments and insight, Elliot. And yeah, we're looking forward to that too.
Yeah. So thank you. And then one other thing before we get into the episode, as we've been bringing up the last few episodes, we would love to put an episode together with basically just all trivia where Indy and I try to stump each other. And we would love for you, the listeners, to participate if you would like by sending us your trivia questions that we can ask each other. So you can send your questions to magiccandh at proton.me. And in the subject line, either put questions for Indy if you want Indy to be the one to answer the questions, or questions for Ryan if you want me to be the one to answer the questions.
Exactly. And now, as usual in today's episodes, we'll also have a couple trivia questions too, but I think we'll still be able to come up with enough for a whole episode, especially if you, the listeners, send some in too. So, yeah, if you would like to have your question asked to one or both of us, I guess we could maybe do that. Anyway, but at least to one of us, feel free to send it in. We'd love to hear them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But with that, let's get into today's episodes. And like I mentioned, this is about an adjacent medium to comic strips, and that's the comic book.
And just as clarification, so there's comic books of Calvin and Hobbes. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about serialized, Spider-Man, Batman, or in Calvin's case, we'll talk about, but specific comic books that he's interested in.
Exactly. So, Ryan, where would you say comic books rank on a list of Calvin's hobbies?
So I think I would rank it slightly lower than sledding, but maybe a peg or two above chewing gum.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, Ryan's kind of making a joke there, but there is a whole story arc where I guess I'll call it a story arc, a series of strips where Calvin talks about chewing gum as an actual hobby. He has chewing magazine that he subscribes to. He takes quizzes to make sure he's getting the most out of his gum experience. So yeah, that does actually count as a hobby.
If you're not chewing hyperbubble, you might as well be chewing your cud.
Which I can actually buy that as like real advertising copy that sounds
Sure.
like the kind of thing you would see somewhere.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, yeah, I would agree. I think comic books are a pretty prominent hobby for Calvin. Again, maybe not as much as like sledding outside, but they're pretty high up there.
Yeah, he does like them.
He does. And so, kind of a related question then, how many times would you guess that comic books are referenced in the strip? And when I say reference, here's what I'm counting. So, either they talk about comic books or we see comic books in frame somewhere.
Ooh, that changes it a little bit. Uh, all right. Well, with that in mind, okay, so my original shot in the dark guess based on nothing was going to be 37, but that was for just like actually mentioning comics. So if we're seeing comic books in frame, I'll bring it up to an even 50.
Okay. Interesting. Yes. So by my count, the actual number is about 76 to 80 times.
Wow.
Yeah, so a rare instance where we under guess instead of over guessing how much something appears.
Yeah, all right. That means that it's actually more prominent than Spaceman Spiff.
Wow, that's I mean again, it sort of
Prominent,
depends how you look at it. Like if you just see it
yeah.
versus, a spaceman spiff, that's kind of more in your face for lack of a better word. So I mean prominent, maybe numerically prominent, but I don't know about overall prominence.
Yeah, and if you took the total number of panels that have Spaceman Spiff in it, I bet Spaceman Spiff wins by a mile.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. So yeah, I wasn't counting individual panels necessarily. Like if it was one strip with two panels, that was counted as one.
Right, right.
But anyway, so yeah, so this is a pretty prominent theme in Calvin and Hobbes, and it's a pretty common hobby for Calvin to participate in. And Stan Lee, who most of our readers probably know, a very prominent person in Marvel, sadly passed away a few years ago, but responsible for a lot of the Marvel we know today. He once said, aside from candy, the only thing a kid probably buys with his own money is a comic book. So maybe Calvin kind of exemplifies this sort of thing too.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely what he buys the most. I can think of one other thing that he buys with his own money, but probably the idea that mostly he buys candy and comic books is pretty accurate. But can you think of anything else that we've seen Calvin buy with his own money?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that comes to mind is he does on a couple occasions buy models to put together.
Yeah, that wasn't what I had in mind, but you're right.
Okay. Let me think. Something else he buy. He also I don't know if we can count this as buying or not because he may have just gotten it out of a dumpster, but he sort of buys dead flowers to give to Susie as a like hate Valentine.
That's true. I don't know if that counts as buying or not, but yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Okay, what were you thinking of
Well, so
though?
the other one I had in mind, and models is actually probably a better answer, but the other one that came to my mind was he bought a record by, I believe, Scrambled Debutante that
Oh, that's right.
glorifies like violence and stuff, and Hobbs is like, your mom's gonna go into conniptions when she sees this lying around, and Calvin is throwing the record away, and he's like, well, I sure didn't buy it for the music. So
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, Calvin admits, yeah, the music's terrible, but I just want to get a reaction out of mom. So
yeah.
Oh, you're right. I hadn't thought about that, but okay. So he'll buy things to annoy the various women in his life, at least his mom and Susie, which maybe all of them. Well, I guess Rosalind and Miss Wormwood, but he doesn't buy stuff for them. But
Right.
he'll do that, and he'll buy candy, and he'll buy comic books.
Yeah.
Okay. And the first appearance of comic books in the strips comes within its first couple months, the 55th strip specifically, assuming I counted right. I counted this by hand. And do you remember what happens in that strip?
Okay, so I'm going to pull back the curtain here a little bit. So we have an outline, and based on something that you said later in the outline, I think my guess is wrong, but I don't know what else to guess. So
Okay.
the best thing that I could come up with is where Calvin ducks into a closet and transforms into Captain Napalm.
Okay. So that comes pretty early, but the first reference to comic books is actually more straight up. We see Calvin and Hobbes reading comic books. This was in one of the early Cub Scout strips. They say,
Okay,
"Oh, we're hopelessly lost, but with this full backpack, we can stay out here for weeks."
right.
Yeah. Then we see them each with a big pile of comic books to read, and Hobbes says, "Well, as long as we don't get hungry."
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, you got to have the essentials if you're going on a trip, which we'll actually see later. They actually pack comic books for trips on multiple occasions.
Yeah, so priorities.
Yes. So this is the first one, and yeah, so we actually see them reading comic books there together. And funnily enough, depending on how you count it, the last reference to comic books is the 54th to the last strip. So the first one was strip 55. This one is 54 to the end. So they're nearly equidistant from the beginning and the end, like the absolute value of comic book discussion or something.
Wow, I bet that means something.
It probably does. Yeah, it probably means nothing. But I thought it was a mildly interesting fact about that. And I say,
Mm,
depending on how you count it, because the last one's more of an implied reference. So they don't technically say comic books, but Calvin says, "It's been 3 weeks and I still haven't received my x ray glasses." And so I am counting this though, because back in the day, I don't think they do this so much now, but comic books would typically have ads for products at the end, including x ray glasses and that sort of thing specifically. So I think that is a reference to comic books, even though they don't say it outright.
yeah, I mean, the only other thing it could be is send away from like a box of cereal, but I think comic
That's
books is
true.
more likely. Right.
Yeah, especially since that specific thing like has actually been advertised in comic
Yeah,
books before.
yeah, for sure. And I want to point out, I love how in this one, Calvin is talking about how as a man of history or whatever, someone who's going to be historically important, it's important that there be logs of his correspondence and stuff because that will tell future historians what they need to know about him. And Hobbes is like, you mean like how your salutations always begin, "Hey, booger brain"?
And that's when we get the line, "It's been 3 weeks and I still haven't received my x ray glasses."
Yeah,
I mean, calling someone a booger brain might be justified if you have to wait that long for the x ray glasses.
that's almost as bad as waiting 6 weeks for a propeller beanie.
I was just about to say that actually. Like, we don't hear that he wrote to them in protest, which is interesting. Maybe
Yeah,
like after that experience, again having this happen with the x ray glasses was too much for him to take, and that's where he had to lash out.
yeah, that's probably it. That makes all kinds of sense.
So anyway, though, back to comics in particular. Some of the time, this is something. So reading comic books is something that both Calvin and Hobbes do without any sort of drama about it. Which I'll say what I mean more about that in a second. So, for instance, there's the first strip with comic books that I mentioned above when they were lost and separated from the troop. There's on the way to the Yukon. So we said they like to pack comic books when they go on trips. They
Right.
stop and read comic books. There's another time when Calvin says, "Come on, Hobbes, if you lend me $1, I'll buy you a comic book." And do you remember what this takes place immediately after?
I think so. I believe this is after Hobbes saves Calvin from Mo, and Calvin is describing to his mom how Hobbes was great, and Mo took one look at him and just about lost his lunch. And so then, as he walks off, he's congratulating Hobbes and thanking him for his service by saying, "If you'll lend me a buck, I'll buy you a comic book."
That's exactly right. Yeah. So Calvin wants to thank Hobbes, but he is a little short, so he needs the help to do it. So yeah, exactly right. Similarly, there's Calvin's almost inspiring way of living. So he tells Hobbes that he lives by the principle to take every day as if it were his last. And he says, kind of inspiring, isn't it? And what is Hobbes' response?
If you were someone else, it might be.
Exactly. So we see them reading comic books and munching on cookies. So that's, I don't know. It's
I
like
think that's a
that
pretty
does,
good way to live.
yeah, that sounds pretty fun to me actually. So, but yeah, maybe not as inspiring as it could have been. Another example of a trip. It's shortly after they set up camp on Mars. They have comic books to read.
Right.
And when Calvin's homesick from school, he can just lay in bed and read comic books. And apparently that's what Hobbes does every day.
Although he doesn't get tea.
That's right. He says, well, your mom doesn't bring me tea in bed. But he does get to sit there and read comic books.
Yeah.
Similarly, this is one of many summer vacation activities. They break out the comic books after a meeting of growths. What are some others you can think of?
Well, the only other one I can think of off the top where Calvin is at least sort of okay with Hobbes reading his comic books. I feel like this kind of straddles the line between the ones where Calvin is okay with it and the ones where he's not. Is when he's doing his spontaneous acts of goodwill and
That's right.
for Christmas, and so he's trying to show Santa that he's good. So he gives Hobbes a comic book and he's like, "Here's a comic book. It's my comic book, but you can read it, but only touch the Mylar bag and use these sterilized tongs to turn the pages and all these things." And Hobbes is like, "I don't think that spontaneous acts of goodwill should be so reluctant." And what's Calvin's response?
Reluctant ones qualify.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so you're right. And that's a really good transition point, too, that straddles a line because before I said a lot of times this happens without drama, but sometimes there's a lot of drama around this where Calvin doesn't want Hobbes to read or even touch, as you mentioned, his comic books. And then Hobbes goes to various lengths to get around this. So the first time we see this comes in the fourth book, Weirdos from Another Planet. And so before this point, all of the strips were just sort of Calvin and Hobbes reading comics together or Calvin never complaining about Hobbes doing this. But now we get instances where like they're playing hide and seek, but instead of going to find Calvin, Hobbes just sneaks away to read his comic books, and then Calvin comes, all right, give them back. Similarly, there's a bee on Calvin's back. So Hobbes says, oh, well, this gives me an idea. Don't you go reading my comic books? And then he makes it worse, doesn't he?
Yeah, because he tells Calvin what's going to happen in the next issue of Captain Napalm. So, I mean, spoilers. Has anyone heard of this concept?
I know, right? And he even says, I don't know if the term spoilers was really being used back then, but he does say the word spoil. He's like, if you spoil this for me, I'll never forgive you. I've waited all month for this to happen. And Hobbes is like, okay, I'll give you a hint. He takes us, no hints, no
No
hints.
hints.
So Calvin's paralyzed by the bee, not literally. He doesn't want to move because he's afraid the bee will sting him. Finally, Hobbes says, oh, there's no bee anymore. He says something like that, say there's not a bee. So Calvin does move. Ow! He gets stung. Hobbes says, I meant, no, there is a bee. Today is opposite day. Which, and if Calvin was unhappy before, he's very unhappy now. And how does this little story arc end?
It ends with Calvin standing at the base of a tree holding a baseball bat while Hobbes is up in the tree. And he's like, remember, opposite day ends at midnight. Hobbes says that. And I believe Calvin says, yes, which being opposite day.
Exactly. And this is maybe, I don't know, argue like the most angry we've ever seen Calvin at Hobbes. Like, I can't think of another time where he literally like chases him with a baseball bat trying to hit him. So,
Yeah, that's about as extreme as it gets. That reminds me of another strip, by the way, where Calvin has what seems to be a bee or something on his back. Do you remember that one?
um, there's one, I think there's one where he gets stung, but the visual we see is this just ginormous bee chasing him, and then he describes it as a harpoon that gored him
Yeah, there
later.
is that one. I was thinking of the one where he's like, I think there's a bee on my back. Hobbs, is there a bee on my back? No. And oh, good. Ow! And Hobbs says, that's a wasp if I ever saw one, or maybe a hornet or something like that.
That's right.
So,
Yeah, I think it's Hornet, but you're right. I wasn't thinking of that one. It's like, so that one, I mean, maybe less intentional, still not so helpful from Hobbs there.
right.
But again, yes, so this is a way to take advantage of Calvin's helpless predicament and read his comic books behind his back. I kind of literally behind his back because he kind of
Yeah,
stands behind him with Calvin with the bee on it.
right.
Uh, yeah, so this is kind of a running theme for a while. There's also one where Calvin floats away on a balloon, kind of spontaneously. Actually, he's just sort of standing there with a balloon, and then it carries him away.
Right.
Which I don't know. I always kind of liked his line there. This probably just goes to show something, but I sure don't know what. Yeah, but in any case, as he's floating away, he calls down to people below and he says, "Tell Hobbs he can't read my comic books just because I'm not around, okay? Oh, yeah, tell my parents what happened too, all right?" Yeah,
Kind of reflects the zoo experience where his first instinct is to go to the tigers.
right. That's right. Yeah. So, oh, it never occurred to me to ask a person for help. So it's like here again, priorities. Make sure Hobbs doesn't read his comic books. Oh yeah, and also tell my parents what happened.
Yeah.
So yeah. On the other hand, then just 12 days later, at least 12 strips later, we see Calvin and Hobbs reading comic books together without any fuss. So it's only some of the time that this causes an issue with Calvin.
Yeah, and the best explanation I can come up with is maybe it's a function of which comic book it is. Like, if it's an old one, that's fine. But if it's brand new, like with the issue of Captain Napalm he's been waiting for a month, or if it's like a particular favorite or something, then he doesn't want Hobbs to touch them. That's my best guess.
Yeah, I think that's plausible. So it could be all right if it's been around a while, then it's okay. But in either case, this is kind of a running gag, but also one that's not always running, if we want to say
Yeah,
it that way.
it's like skipping or
Yeah,
something.
exactly. So, another kind of instance. So you mentioned before trying to show Santa how good he was. I don't remember if this is the same, or I think this is a different instance, but a similar thing. So Calvin and Hobbes are fighting, and Hobbes, like, I don't know if he threatens to tell or Calvin's like, please don't tell. And he's like, well, maybe if you let me read all your comic books, I won't tell Santa over my dead body.
Dear Santa, you know what Calvin did?
Exactly. And then there's another time where Calvin gets a letter from Santa Claus. Now, Claus is spelled Claws, which eventually gives a clue as to its real author. But it says Calvin's the most rotten kid in the world, and he's got one last chance to get off the naughty list and onto the good boy list. And the suggestions for this are maybe let an animal read your comic books sometime, along with maybe making an animal a snack sometime.
Yeah, well, you got to do what you can to get food and entertainment, I guess.
You do. So obviously, it's really Hobbes that wrote it, not Santa. Hobbes says, well, that's what Santa would have written if he weren't so busy right now, which maybe. But on that note, I find it kind of interesting too that it refers to an animal rather than Hobbes specifically. I mean, you figure, Santa's watching, he must have known who Hobbes was and who Hobbes was to Calvin, but I don't know. Maybe Hobbes thought that would sound more suspicious instead of just saying an animal. It's like general good advice or.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to be kind to animals generally, and well, it just so happens that your best friend is an animal, so that's an easy option. You may as well just go for the easy one, right?
That's true. Yeah, so we guide Calvin instead of being so sledgehammery about it.
Exactly.
In any case, so like we said, this is kind of a running gag. Sometimes, at least, there's this tension where Calvin doesn't want Hobbes to read his comic books, and Hobbes actually does. Now, Mom thinks Calvin should be glad Hobbes is more literate than most stuffed animals. And I have to say, the more times I read this, the more hilarious I find that line, especially the way she says it. It's like, you should be thankful. Most stuffed animals can't read at all. Like, look how lucky you are.
She's so deadpan about it.
She is too. Like, it's a very, I mean, this is kind of obviously a very motherly thing to say. I don't know. It
Yeah.
just seems very, it amuses me a lot. So, in any case, you should be glad he's more literate than most stuffed animals. You should be willing to share. But why doesn't Calvin want to share?
Well, Hobbes keeps drawing mustaches on the characters.
Exactly. So, in this case, he specifically says he drew a mustache and glasses on every picture of Nuke Man last issue in pen. Yeah. And this actually happens again in a different point, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah.
So Hobbes will draw mustaches on the superheroes. He'll spoil what happens.
Oh no, Captain Steroid just got his kidneys punched out with an I-beam. Gross, now he's bleeding all over the... And then Mom is like, maybe I should read those comic books, or let me see those, or something like that. Now don't you go reading them first.
Yeah. So, yeah, and this kind of getting your kidneys punched out with an I-beam, we'll say a little bit more about that kind of thing after a while, too.
Yes.
But first, though, this also factors into occasions of Hobbes pouncing on Calvin at the door, which is another running gag that we've talked about before. So, and I find it intriguing. A lot of times when he doesn't pounce, what we see him doing instead is reading comic books.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so there's one fairly early on where he pounces on Calvin, pounces on Calvin, pounces on him. So then Calvin's expecting this. And he's like, I'm home. I'm home. I'm home. And then he gets to his room. Well, so you're home. And Hobbes doesn't bother to pounce. He's just there reading comic books.
Yeah.
Then on another occasion, Calvin specifically thwarts Hobbes by getting his mom to open the door instead. And then Hobbes later says cheater or sissy or something like that. But since he couldn't pounce on him, what is he doing? He's laying in bed reading comic books.
Which is what he's been doing all day, apparently.
That's right. Not with tea in bed, but he gets to just lay in bed and read comic books instead of having to go to school like poor Calvin.
Exactly.
Now, on another occasion, Calvin tries to thwart Hobbes with a decoy. So he gets home, imagines being pounced on, and then it's kind of elaborate, actually, because he takes a broom, like saws it in two pieces, attaches them together somehow, makes a base for it, which is almost the weirdest part.
Yeah, I don't know how he
But
did
anyway,
that.
yeah, and then he puts his jacket on it, puts it on the door, and it's like, I'm home. But then Hobbes decides to play along, right? Oh, why, hello, Calvin. Do come in. Oh, may I read your comic books? I may. Thank you, Calvin. May I draw mustaches on all the superheroes? I may. Oh, joy. And so Calvin says, I'll get him for this if it's the last thing I ever do, or something like that. So, in any case, that's our running gag, and that's a lot of references to reading comic books. There are a few references to real life comic books and superheroes, as we mentioned a couple times before, I think. Batman's the only one that's mentioned by name, and this happens a few times.
Right, so there's the Batfax,
Yes,
getting Batman junk at the museum, and then one of our listeners pointed out we missed the tracing the Batman logo and adding fangs on his report on bats.
exactly. Yeah, so Batman is mentioned or referred to several times and by name, and with, or if you count with the bat prefix, that's clearly Batman. Okay.
Yeah.
There's also references to Superman, not by name, but we get up and away, which was a classic Superman phrase, and we get a reference to kryptonite.
Right. Now, I can think of one other, I just recently realized, a superhero comic book character that's mentioned by name that I think counts. I think he's a comic book character. I can
Okay.
give you a hint, but do you want to take a stab at it?
Um, I'm not sure. Now, I mentioned before that Calvin calls Hobbes Doctor Doom one time, but that I thought that wasn't a reference to comics. It was just saying like,
Right.
Mr. Cynical or whatever, Doctor Doom. So I don't think it's that one. I'm trying to think.
Okay, I'm going to give you a
Nothing comes to mind. Oh, yeah, give me a hint.
yeah. The hint is Crisco.
Oh, that's right. They mentioned Astro Boy.
Yeah,
You're right. And that's funny that you mentioned that too, because when I was growing up or when I first read that strip, I didn't know that Astro Boy was a real character. So
me
I thought it
either.
was just like, okay, I'm like, oh yeah, you look futuristic like Astro Boy. Okay, but you're right. That actually is a real comic character, Astro Boy.
And just for context, listeners, so this is when Calvin is going to get his picture taken at school, and he asks mom for some Crisco and puts it in his hair and turns it into this kind of loop thing. And his mom's like, "You're not going to picture day like that." So he has to comb it all out. But there's still Crisco left in his hair. So at the bus stop, Hobbs styles it into this Astro Boy look, which ends up being on
That's
his
right.
picture.
Yeah, which actually is what Astro Boy looks like, at least hair wise. So
Yeah,
yeah, all right, very good. Yeah, I forgot that, but you're right. That's another reference. Okay, so that's the other one mentioned by name. So I think Batman, Astro Boy, and then Superman clearly references to. Those are the ones I think are mentioned. Real quick before we move on, just one thing that I think is funny about the whole Astro Boy Crisco thing is Susie's reaction. You remember
yes.
how she reacts to this?
I wish I'd had some Crisco.
Right? Yeah, which is a little bit out of character. Like I could imagine Susie being like, "Oh, how immature our boys are so, or, whatever. Oh, that's Calvin." But no, so she's sitting there in this nice dress with a bow in her hair. It's like, wow, I wish I could do that too.
Yeah.
So
I wonder what she would have done if she did have some Crisco.
yeah, I think she probably wouldn't have done it like Calvin did just because she would want to do her own thing, but maybe it would similarly be like things stick out in different ways or
Yeah, Pippi Longstocking or something.
yeah, I mean that'd be her hair's not very long, so she could be
Yeah.
Pippi short stockings, but
There you go.
I know it's hair, not stockings, but you know what I mean. So
Yeah.
okay. No, good reference though. Okay. So that being said, there are a few references to what we might call real life comic book superheroes, but especially as the strip went on, it was more common to see references to what I guess I'll call pretend comic book characters that Watterson made up for the strip.
Yeah.
This is probably better overall because then it can be more of a parody. You can sort of call out things or do commentary without saying a specific existing work. So
Right.
that's probably a good choice. And it also makes it fun too, because then it's like it almost makes the world more real that there's this separate set of comic book characters that exist in Calvin's world that is not just like a crossover to what the readers know. So
And at least one of them is recurring. So there's this thread.
yes, yes, I think multiple ones are recurring, but probably one more than most. So and that brings us to another trivia question. So Ryan, who was the first comic book character made up for the strip that is mentioned by name?
I mean, it has to be Captain Napalm.
Okay, Captain Napalm is an excellent guess. I could see how you'd say that. It's actually wrong. The first made up comic book character that appears in this strip is actually Super Toad.
Oh, oh man, yeah, I
This
completely forgot about Super Toad.
I can see why. He only appears once. This is in the 77th strip, so it's in the very first book, just Calvin and Hobbes,
Okay,
and
wait,
is a throwaway pan. Oh, go ahead.
I'm gonna make the argument then that Captain Napalm might come first because it's not a comic book, but when Calvin transforms into Captain Napalm, might that might be before the 70s. We got to check on that, but
So I can tell you, Captain Napalm is actually the second one. So
okay.
he comes less than a week later.
And that's when
We
Calvin
get
transforms.
right. So he
Okay.
ducks into the closet and transforms into Captain Napalm. So yeah,
Oh wow.
I thought you would probably guess Captain Napalm, which is an excellent guess, but Super Toad actually comes first at a bedtime story that Dad is reading to Calvin.
Yeah. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, that only shows up in the throwaway joke of that Sunday strip. It's not present at all in the main strip. Is that right?
That's right. So So he's going to read him a story, and then we see him going. So in the next panel, Super Toad goes plooey, and
Yes, yes.
yes. So yeah, so that's I thought that was a tricky question. So I will
Yeah,
say
good one.
Captain Napalm is thank you. Captain Napalm was a great guest though. So that is the second one. And I assume this is who you were thinking is the main recurring one.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, so he definitely recurs. There are others that are also mentioned, referred to more than once, but Captain Napalm is the most recurring one, I think. And I would say he's probably the leader of most of the superheroes.
Yeah, I agree because there's Captain Napalm's Thermonuclear League of Liberty. So
Right. So it makes it sound like he's the one in charge or like the main first member or what have you. So, okay. So, yeah. Super Toad only appears in that one time. He's technically the first, but Captain Napalm is the most prominent.
yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yes. And later we'll mention a few others. But first, so we've talked about all these different references to comic books, how frequently Calvin and or Hobbes reads them, the references to made up superheroes. And so with all these references, you might think, oh, well, Watterson must be a fan of comic books too, right?
You
But
would think
what,
so.
yeah, but what does he actually think about them?
He is not a big fan, as it turns out. So his
No.
yeah, his quote in the 10th anniversary book is you can make your superhero a psychopath, you can draw gut splattering violence, and you can call it a graphic novel, but comic books are still incredibly stupid.
Exactly. So, yeah, so surprisingly, given how prominent comic books and superheroes are in the strip, Watterson doesn't seem to be a fan. And now I'm going to say personally, I think this is a bad take. So it's also kind of surprising to me, at least, because it's easy to imagine people criticizing comic strips as stupid or juvenile. And in Watterson's case, at least, he sees them as possessing artistic merit, which I think I speak for both of us in saying we would agree with that. I mean, especially
Yeah.
with Calvin and Hobbes. So, yeah, so I think this is a bad take and kind of surprising. There's another reason why it's kind of surprising, but we'll come back to that later.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll have more to say on it later too. For now, I'll just say I think that the story that you tell and how you tell it, not in the sense of the medium you use, but in the sense of like storytelling elements. Do you show versus tell? Do you do you let the reader fill in the blanks? Does the story have a beginning, middle, and end? That sort of thing is much more important than whether it's drawn or written in a novel or on a TV show. You can tell the same story in all these different media, and it's a good story no matter which one you choose. It's a matter of, are you a good storyteller?
Yeah, exactly. I would agree with that also. And I think to a large extent Watterson would too. That being said, so yeah, I think that's kind of a bad take on comic books. However, let's talk about the reasons why Watterson might have had this negative view of comic books and where his attitude might have come from. So, first, I do want to say a little bit about what Watterson arguably gets right about this.
Yeah.
So, the first thing I'll say is when he made this quote, so when he's writing the 10th anniversary book, this would have been probably 94 or 95 when he's writing this.
Hmm.
So this would have been in the heyday of Image Comics. And I won't say a whole lot about this, just as a little bit of history. Image Comics was kind of a rebellion by some comic creators who felt they were being mistreated by the industry, so they formed their own new company, which probably with some justification, honestly.
Hmm.
But in any case, so Image Comics comes along and everything is extreme and we're not approved by the Comics Code Authority and everyone's costume has too many pockets. That was not as important, but I think it's true, so I just threw it in there. So, in light of the way Image Comics kind of were, I think that could have justified maybe some of Watterson's attitude or motivated it, given that, because that would have been fairly prominent at that time.
Mm-hmm.
As far as gut splattering violence that he mentions in the quote in the 10th anniversary book you mentioned before, So I'm not familiar with a lot of comics that had that, but I do think there were some. And, even in sort of more mainstream comics, it is arguable that the violence can be too over the top sometimes. So it's not crazy to see that as a point of criticism.
Yeah,
This is actually parodied in this. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
that was my whole comment. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, so yeah, this is actually parodied in the fight where a female superhero who is identified as an Amazon, so presumably Amazon girl, is fighting some other unknown character. I don't know, maybe Captain Steroid, who got his kidneys punched out before. I'm not sure, but anyway, so they're fighting, and this hyper violence is clearly parodied. So they're fighting, and she pulls out the hyper phase distortion blaster,
See
and
issue
she,
whatever.
yeah, and so she blows a hole like clear through the guy's torso. And what is his reaction to this?
I could feel my spine shatter. It hurt a lot.
Yes, the addition of a lot at the end
Yes.
just cracks me up every time. I mean, it's
Yeah.
obviously hilarious anyway, but yeah. And so, now again, in one sense, it's clearly a parody. However, I can't verify this, but this actually does remind me of a scene that happens in Punisher comics. So, one that I've seen criticized before. So, he gets shot by some bad guy or something, and in his narration's like, that's one rib gone, not broken, gone. And it was like,
Wow.
wait, what? Yeah, so like supposedly like his whole rib was like vaporized by the shot, and then of course he's still able to coherently think about this and whatever. So yeah, and that's again, I don't know if that specifically inspired that parody by Watterson, but it does remind me of it. It is kind of reminiscent.
Yeah.
The beginning narration also reminds me a little bit of something from the graphic novel The Dark Knight Returns about Batman. Again, this is probably even more likely to be just a coincidence, but the the Calvin and Hobbes strip with Amazon Girl and whoever fighting, it starts, there were two ways to resolve our differences. I ruled out a thoughtful discussion. And so then they start fighting, and okay. But so there's a scene in The Dark Knight Returns, and this is where an aging Batman has kind of come out of retirement because of how bad things are, and he's fighting some bad guy. And so his narration he's thinking at this point is, I believe a criminal has a gun on him at this point, and he thinks there are 7 workable defenses from this situation. 3 kill instantly. 3 disarm with minimal contact. 1 hurts. And the one that hurts is the one that he does. So he doesn't just disarm with minimal contact. He doesn't kill the guy, but he like kicks him, and the guy like can't walk anymore, or at least temporarily or whatever. So
Mm.
again, it is kind of similar. It's probably a coincidence. And again, I don't know that I describe that as over the top. I mean, Batman actually is showing restraint there in what he does,
Right.
but it does kind of remind me of this. So all this is to say, like, the criticisms and even the parodies that Watterson does, they're not completely off base. They do seem to reflect at least some things that are true about comic books.
Yeah, although I would argue, and it's rare that I take a position that is contrary to a position Bill Watterson has taken, but I'm going to go ahead. I think any medium can take it too far. Right? It's not something that's special about comic books that can be too violent. You can do that in a movie or TV. You can do that in a novel. Like there's gory violence or whatever is not limited to comic books. It's just maybe a particular set of comic books did that, but you don't have to do that in a comic book or any other medium.
Exactly. And yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I would say, there's certainly TV shows or movies and probably comic books that I wouldn't think are good in the things they portray. But that doesn't mean I think that's sort of a blanket judgment about the entire industry, or that there aren't good examples too. So yeah, so you and I are in agreement about this.
Yeah.
Again, though, I think there is some legitimacy to some of the criticisms that Watterson makes, and I do want to. Again, like I said, I think what he said was a bad take, but I do want to be fair about it.
Yeah, and I
And
think, maybe comic books are a little more notorious for doing that sort of thing, or at least, like you said, the comic books of the time might have been a little more notorious for doing that.
that's certainly possible. And on that note, so in the 10th anniversary book, you mentioned the comment that he makes about comic books. Now, he attaches this to a strip about comic books from Calvin and Hobbes, obviously. And it's interesting though. So even though his quote is about making your hero a psychopath and having gut splattering violence, that's actually not what he's pointing out in the strip. So here we have Calvin actually saying that this is something we'll get to later, but he's talking about how comic books can actually be good, and we'll say more about that in a second. But Hobbes says, "Is Amazon Girl's superpower the ability to squeeze that figure into that suit?" And Calvin says, "Nah, they can all do that," which is true. That is accurate to, again, what we'll call real life superheroes. So, and comic book characters. So you might say female comic book characters tend to have body proportions that are, if not unrealistic, then at best uncommon, let's say.
Yeah, they maybe don't do a whole lot to help with positive body image and whatnot for actual humans.
Yes, it's not a common body type, let's say, that female comic book characters tend to have. And they also tend to wear skin tight, skimpy outfits, which obviously is necessary to fight crime effectively.
Right, then the bullets can go right through the suit.
Right, yeah. So and of course, it also distracts the bad guys. So
Yes.
yeah, I mean, I think, right, that's clearly true. You wouldn't want to, as a woman, go out and fight crime without wearing something skin tight and skimpy. That would just be foolish.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you heard it here. If we've got any aspiring vigilantes in our audience, now you know.
Female ones in particular.
Female specifically, yeah.
Yeah. Now, the traditional kind of main demographic for comic books has been like boys, especially teenage boys and adult men. And there are some studies that suggest that those demographics find this sort of thing appealing.
You're kidding.
Yeah, I know. I was shocked to hear about these studies too.
Yeah.
But yeah, now Calvin's dad seems to agree also. So bringing it back to Calvin and Hobbes for a second, there's one. I've actually got it here. I'm going to read this.
This is a good
So
one.
Calvin says, yeah, Calvin says, "For show and tell today, I don't have anything to show. But I'll tell you that when I'm at school, my mom puts on a patriotic leotard, a cape, and knee-high, high-heeled boots, and she fights crime as a superheroine. I hope you're all duly impressed. Thank you very much." So then his mom brings this. She says, "That's the note his teacher sent home with him." And what does dad say?
Wow, show me that outfit sometime.
Exactly, which agreed, I can understand the reaction.
Sure.
So, yeah, so obviously there's a bit of what might be called gratuity in terms of depictions of females, the things they wear, how they look, etc. in comic books.
Oh, by the way, just while we're on that note, do you remember how Calvin's dad supposedly reacted the first time he saw Calvin's mom?
Yes, I believe he went something like which
Yeah,
that maybe
that's about
wasn't a
right.
great sound effect. Yeah. But yeah, so Calvin saw birds do a mating dance on TV, and he said, "Dad, did you do a mating dance when you first saw Mom?" And then he acts it out like that. So,
And dad says, yes, that's more or less how I reacted.
yes. And then Mom says, "To what, wise guy?" Think carefully. So, but yeah, so if that's what she was wearing when he met her, yeah, maybe maybe that would explain that reaction.
Yes.
Yeah, so this seems to be a fair point. Now, here's actually a personal story for me on this. I don't think it's published anymore, but when I was growing up, and for a while, there was a magazine called Wizard Magazine, and this was all about comic books. So, like, you would get it, and it would tell you about news in the industry, maybe upcoming story arcs, things about your favorite comic book characters, what have you. Okay, so it was fun, and I got this in the mail for a while growing up. And on this one particular occasion, the cover art for it had this superhero team where the female characters were posed somewhat suggestively.
Mm-hmm,
Okay.
mm-hmm.
And my mother got mad about this, and she was like telling me how, like, oh, I don't like that, and the way that looks. And I remember saying, like, well, I'm sorry, I didn't make the cover. I don't even read that comic, which was true, I will say. This wasn't deflection. Like, I actually didn't.
Right.
But anyway, so that's, yeah, this is something that I can sort of personally verify. I mean, it's probably believable anyway, but yeah, so, this sort of thing happens. There's also criticism within the industry itself. And so, one character I've seen this attached to is a DC character named Starfire. And this particular criticism I saw had to do with a popular cartoon show. It's probably still popular, but especially back when it was first on. So, this was the show Teen Titans.
Oh yeah, I
And
remember that.
so, yeah, and so this is a group of teenage superheroes who live together and fight crimes and have problems, what have you. The leader is Robin, Batman's sidekick, and then there's others, including this one, Starfire. And so, what was pointed out, so if you watch this show, especially if you were a girl watching this show, you might see, oh, here's this character Starfire, and wow, she's really impressive. I want to be like her. And so maybe you're inspired to go buy a comic book with Starfire in it. Okay, which fine. And if you watch the show, her clothes might be a little weird because she's a superhero, she's an alien, but it's not like suggestive or anything. But then if you go buy a comic with Starfire in it, what you very well could see would be adult Starfire like walking around nude by the pool, thinking how, well, in my home planet, nudity was normal. It's so weird how people have hangups about it down here, which obviously is just promoting, cultural sensitivity and striking a blow against ethnocentrism, of course.
Yes, I'm sure that was their motive.
Yes, that was definitely the motive for that, and not clearly just a thinly veiled excuse to have this, scantily or non clad character walking around.
You wouldn't expect a multi-billion-dollar industry to do things to try to generate more revenue by appealing to the lowest common denominator, would you?
I certainly would not expect that. I would be shocked if any corporation ever did that.
Yeah, ethics, man.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so maybe we're kind of belaboring the point, but yeah, this is a fair criticism of something about comics. Like, yeah, no, that's not her special power. Every female comic character can squeeze that figure into that suit.
Yeah, I'll just point out one other thing. Simpsons parodied this at least once, probably more than once, but there's one I remember where some subset of the family ends up kind of doing like a magic school bus inside the human body thing. I don't remember the setup.
Oh wow.
I think it was a Halloween episode, as you might expect for that sort of thing. But so at one point they have to exit whatever vehicle they're in, and the white blood cells start attacking them, and one of them starts eating Marge's clothes, and it starts, it eats just enough to be suggestive, but not, over the line, so to speak. And she's like, "Wow, these white blood cells really know when to stop." So
That does sound like a parody of that too. That's pretty funny.
yeah,
So yeah, so clearly this is something that could be a problem in the industry. It's worth parodying. On maybe a lesser note, sort of more less about the content of comics and more about sort of comic book buying behavior, I guess I'll say. So there's one where Calvin's talking about how he bought 5 issues of the new whatever comic that came out. And he's saying, well, I'm going to store these in airtight plastic bags in the closet where moisture can't affect them. And these will be collector's items someday. They'll finance my retirement. And Yeah, this could be true in some cases. For instance, like Action Comics #1, the first appearance of Superman. First, like back in, I believe, 1938.
Hmm.
That actually could be true for that. So copies of that have sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right.
On the other hand, in most cases, this is not the case, and comic books aren't going to be some amazing investment you can put together. So, one example I can think of, again, back with Superman, and this would have been in the 90s too, around the same time, there was a story arc where Superman died. So, there was the whole death of Superman story arc. And this actually made national news, and there were people who bought copies of the comic where this finally happens, thinking this could be this amazing investment. And while it was sort of a significant event, later Superman comes back and it's like, well, he wasn't actually dead. He was basically like in a coma, maybe sort of in stasis. And then he comes back. And I don't mean this in a way to disparage the story. It actually was a pretty interesting story arc, and we had some fun elements that happened along the way. But what did end up happening as a result is people who thought, oh, I can't believe it. They killed off Superman, and I'm going to save this comic where this happens forever, and this could be worth a lot of money. Well, that just didn't happen.
Well, and the other part of the problem is that the other kids' moms probably didn't throw out their stash, so everyone has one.
Exactly. So, yeah, Hobbes points out that if every kid in America has 5 copies of this, how will it be a collector's item? And yeah, the goal is for the other guy's mom to throw them away, which unfortunately does happen. In fact, not comic books. My dad actually had a whole bunch of baseball cards when he was a kid,
Mm.
and then his mother threw them away after, I think, when he was in college or something. Not thinking it's like, oh well, this is just old kid stuff. He doesn't need these anymore. So
Did he have a rookie Mickey Mantle or something?
I actually don't know, but I guess it's possible. So
Mm.
I'm sure that I'm sure some of those probably would have been valuable if we still had them. But
Yeah.
yeah. But in any case, so yeah, one other sort of criticism of comics as an industry, I think in that same strip I was just talking about, Calvin says something like, "Wow, look at the great committee that drew this episode, or sorry, that drew this issue." And I actually have seen this in real life, not often, but I remember one time I saw some new comic at a comic store, and I think they had the first 3 issues or so. And I remember thinking, why does the art look so different in each of these? And I looked, and it was different artists for each of them. And
Hmm.
yeah, that's not a good sign.
Yeah, I am with Watterson's criticism of drawing this sort of thing by committee. I mean, there's gonna be some collaboration that happens if the project is big enough, but as a general rule, I feel like stories are much better told if they reflect usually one person's view because as you add more people into the mix, it starts to kind of average out and becomes a pretty bland story. So that's my take.
Exactly. And I can also tell you that what's more standard in the comic books industry is you'll have what I guess we'll call runs, right? Where you'll have a certain writer and or a certain artist that are contracted for a length of time or a certain story arc or what have you. So you do get that continuity
Yeah,
with both the art and the point of view. So that's what's supposed to happen. So if it's changing, especially every episode, that's usually a sign something's very wrong.
right.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about some of the potential reasons for criticism of comic book, which have some legitimacy to them. I also think a few other things might have informed Watterson's attitude. So we know that he was a Batman fan growing up, so it's possible he didn't like the way that that character in particular was portrayed over time.
Right.
So, for instance, if he grew up watching the '60s Batman TV show, then
Great show.
you know yeah, which is very fun, but it's also very silly. And so I think a lot of Batman fans would tend to say, well, yeah, that's fun, but that's not really what the characters like, for lack of a better way to put that. So if you were more wanting the sort of campy, silly kind of thing, and then you see, the dark and gritty version, it's possible you could think, oh well, this isn't fun anymore, or that's not what you're looking for. It's possible that motivated his attitude. I'm not saying it did. I'm just saying it's a possibility.
Yeah.
There was also the comic The Dark Knight Returns, which I mentioned earlier, which again, this was supposed to be not only an aging Batman coming out of retirement to because things were so bad again, it also marked a return from sort of past sort of sillier versions of Batman to a more serious version. And this came out I think 85 or 86. So this would have been right around the time Calvin and Hobbes was starting.
Hmm.
There's also in the 90s, then, there's the Nightfall story arc. And this one I think is interesting in light of the quote we mentioned before. So he says you could turn your character into a psychopath, et cetera, but comic books will still be incredibly stupid. Well, in this story arc, Batman has his back broken by the supervillain Bane.
Oh yeah, that comes up in one of the movies too. Yeah.
It does. Actually, two of the movies, but well, maybe only one, but one's terrible, so we won't worry about that anyway. But yeah, but the main one you're probably thinking of is a good one. But in any case, so yeah, so Batman's out of commission and he he picks someone who he's only recently become allies with, but he picks this person to kind of take over for him as Batman while he's recovering. This is a character called Azrael. And this starts out okay, but Azrael, it turns out, is mentally unstable and he actually starts to descend kind of into madness. And over time, he becomes more and more unhinged and more violent. And Batman has to basically come back and reclaim the mantle of Batman from him.
Hmm.
And this is interesting to me in this context because you could see that as an example of taking an established character and turning him into a psychopath in a certain sense. So it does make me wonder if Watterson could have had that specifically in mind when he was making this quote.
Yeah, maybe so. That seems plausible.
Yeah. I'll say something more about this in a second. But anyway, this is just a little bit of speculation about why Watterson might have been down on comics. One other potential thing, and this is something we'll talk about in a future episode, is I wonder if he doesn't like the licensing aspect of it. So we know he feels that if he had licensed Calvin and Hobbes, that would have cheapened it artistically. And as we know, comic books are extremely licensed. So
Absolutely, yeah. There's a whole
yeah,
cinematic universe.
yeah, cinematic universe, comics themselves, toys, cartoons. I mean,
Yeah.
you name it. So it's also possible that that was part of the motivation for his negative view of comic books.
Yeah, maybe. I'll have some thoughts on that in a minute, but yeah, that could be part of it.
All right. So in any case, so that's our that's our sort of fair reading of the criticism, our speculation about why Watterson might have had that attitude. Here's what I think he gets wrong, though. So one thing that I like to point out about comics is that these are essentially a modern type of mythology.
Hmm.
So if you think back to history, we have always had stories of people with unusual abilities or doing amazing feats. This has been part of literature and what we would now call great literature in a lot of cases, basically for all of humanity. So whereas, the ancient Greeks would have talked about Hercules or Achilles or somebody, now we have people like Batman or Superman or Spider-Man, and this performs a similar role. And I think if you view it in that kind of tradition, we can see certainly the potential for value and also that it's not just something that's new or having to be gratuitous. This is sort of an extension of something with literary value for hundreds of years.
Right.
Yeah, so that's one thing I think is worth thinking about in terms of comics. There's also this sort of aspect. So Calvin at one point, this is another sort of not parody strip, but Calvin talking about comics. He's saying, "Oh, they're not just escapist fantasy; they're sophisticated social critiques with complex moral issues." And we're supposed to view this ironically, but I think Calvin's actually right in some cases.
Yeah.
So, for instance, oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I agree. I mean, I'm not even a comic book aficionado. Like I don't I've never really been into Marvel or DC comics, but I know the stories and I can absolutely see that there's social critiques and such in these stories.
Exactly. Yeah, and so here maybe just a few instances of that. So we've mentioned Batman a little bit. I think there can be a lot of moral value to the kinds of things Batman does and stands for. I'll say something about the Nightfall story arc I mentioned a second ago too. So I mentioned how Batman's out of commission, someone takes over for him, but that person becomes more and more unstable, more kind of psychopathic, and Batman has to basically defeat him and reclaim being Batman from him. But the way he ultimately does this is not by just like beating the new Azrael Batman in a fight. He basically outsmarts him sort of intellectually and psychologically and gets Azrael to eventually confront himself and who he's become and admit, yes, yeah, I'm not Batman, you are. I need to stop what I'm doing. And then Batman eventually like rehabilitates him even.
Hmm.
So, and I think that kind of narrative counts against the idea that, oh, yeah, there's gut splattering violence. We turn characters into psychopaths. Here we actually see, no, no, what it means to be a hero is actually to be more aspirational and, stand for something and stand for the right thing. And then even in cases where it's possible, show a measure of mercy to someone who's become your enemies and rehabilitate them. So, I think that's a good example of that sort of thing. We can also think of Superman. So I'm going to mention here the movie that came out last year, which I actually thought was extremely well done.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, and one thing that I found one reason I enjoy this so much was it was really about hope and inspiration at its core. So you have this character who has, we might say, godlike power. And what does he do with this? He goes around trying to save people and promote kindness, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can also say one of the plot points for that movie's minor spoilers if you haven't seen it, so I do apologize for that, has to do with Superman basically intervening in an international conflict to save some people who are basically being, they're threatened with a war from this much more powerful country. And this actually was based on a real comic book story where Superman ends up renouncing his American citizenship, not because he's protesting America, but because he doesn't want his actions to be interpreted as reflecting necessarily the American government and therefore causing international incidents or tensions between countries, which I find is a pretty interesting and sophisticated sort of moral issue to be looking at.
Yeah. I didn't know about that. Like I say, I don't know much about comic books, but yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Then, similarly, you might think of someone like Captain America. Again, I'm going to mention a movie here, but if you've seen the first Captain America movie in the MCU, what we see is Steve Rogers, who doesn't start off with any powers or anything. He's actually pretty small and weak, but he has this sense of duty and what he should do as a good person or someone trying to be a good person. So he joins the army. Basically, he tricks his way into the army because they want to
Yeah, they won't
exclude him
accept
because of
him.
his physical limitations. He manages to get there, and then he proves himself to be worthy of getting these superpowers. Not because he knows about it, but just because of the way he behaves, like his not only dedication to training, but his willingness to sacrifice himself to, he thinks, save everyone from a grenade in this one particular scene.
Right.
And so again, I think this is something that's pretty common with superheroes. We have people with amazing powers and abilities, but the point is always that this power is in service of others and uplifting the downtrodden and using this power for the good of other people.
Right. I'm just going to throw in as a side note. I think Andy and I talked about this off recording another time, but there's a series called the Reckoners series that's about basically what would happen if people got superpowers, but everyone with superpowers was evil. How do you how do you stand up to that? And just made me think of that, where what a lot of these stories are about: what do you do with the abilities that you have, and it's not the abilities that make you good or bad, it's what you do with them and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that can be really seen as a through line in a lot of the most popular comic books. And I think if it was just about people who had amazing powers doing things, I don't think they would be that popular. I
Yeah,
think the fact that it's about using your powers to do good, to lift people up, to be a symbol of inspiration, I think that's part of why they're so popular. And I think that gives them a real value and why they really can serve as sophisticated moral critiques despite criticisms to the contrary.
yeah, I agree. Now, I will say, so in that strip you mentioned, Calvin is saying these aren't just escapist fantasy, and they're not necessarily. If a lot of these comics do have social critiques and the things that we've been discussing. I will point out, I don't think that escapist fantasy is inherently a bad thing. Sometimes it's fun to just unplug and escape for a little bit. But yeah, I don't think that that's all that these are. They can be, but like any storytelling medium, they can go deeper than that.
Exactly. So yeah, I would agree. Sometimes escapist fantasy is okay too, but even if we granted the point that escapist fantasy could be bad in some way, I think it's true that they're not just escapist fantasy. So, despite this being portrayed as ironic, I think Calvin's actually right about this one.
Yeah,
One other quick example I'll mention here has to do with the X-Men, just to say that X-Men have pretty much always been sort of a metaphor or stand-in for bigotry of various kinds.
you're right.
So you've got the X-Men are mutants, so there's people who hate mutants and want to stop them or pass laws against them or what have you. And this has obvious and deliberate parallels to real life in terms of racism or LGBTQ people over time. So again, comics have always had this function, trying to show what's wrong with society in a way that helps inspire change because of the way people use power not to oppress but to uplift.
Exactly.
And I think even we mentioned licensing a second ago. I think that can even go into that a little bit too, because if you show a product or like I'm wearing a Batman shirt as we record this, and I feel like if what inspires you about a comic book character is what they do with their power in this way, or is the kind of moral stance that they take, I think that could be a good thing. So by not you're not just a walking billboard for what the company is, like in that other Calvin and Hobbes strip where they joke about that, but you could be saying, no, I'm a fan of this character because I like what they stand for. I think this is they embody worthy ideals. So I think there can even be something there too. Like, yes, as we said, we've got these multinational corporations that want to make money, but that doesn't mean there can't be moral and social value even to advertising them.
Sure. And I will say, on the note of licensing, so like Indy said, we're going to have a whole episode about Bill Watterson and licensing and Calvin and Hobbes. I, if I've got this right, Watterson has actually said he doesn't necessarily object to other cartoonists licensing their creations. He just didn't want to be forced to license his own. He felt like the artists should be able to make that decision themselves. And Calvin and Hobbes, in his mind, should not be licensed. If Jim Davis wants to license Garfield or Charles Schultz wants to license Peanuts, go for it. Just don't make me do it. I think that was his general stance.
I think that's right. Yeah. Now, he did also think that if he were to license Calvin and Hobbes in particular, it would cheapen the strip. And I think the quote is something like he says, "Who would believe in the innocence of a boy and his tiger if they were, used to sell coffee mugs or something like that, or if
Right.
they." Which I think that's legitimate too. So I do think that is a real potential that licensing can cheapen the artistic value of something, but I think it doesn't have to. And I think in the sense of superheroes, it can even function in a good way, not necessarily a cheapening way.
Yeah, I think it depends both on what the thing is that's being licensed and on how you do the licensing. There's a lot of
Exactly.
factors.
Yes. And I'll even say this is one example that comes to mind a little bit. Sometimes we see superheroes explicitly used in ads for basically social issues or what we might say like moral values, right? So one that comes to mind is there's this poster that was made of Superman, and Superman's telling these kids something like, hey, if you hear someone disparaging someone else because of where they come for, that's un-American. America is about accepting people from everywhere, and anyone could be American if they want to. So, you know, if you hear this happening, tell them that's what's really not American or something. So,
Yeah,
so again, a very positive, inclusive message explicitly done by this character. And yeah, so it's licensed. People make money off this. Maybe not that particular ad, but the character in general. But it still does something very valuable and worthwhile.
right. Agreed.
So, one more quote from Watterson now, this time about comic strips. And so I think we've mentioned this before, especially in our art episode, where Calvin's talking about high art versus low art and their characteristics. And he says the comic strip is an example of low art, which is vapid and juvenile. Now, we're supposed to disagree with Calvin, though. So I think we could
Yeah,
probably guess this anyway.
and I think it's right. We should
Yes,
disagree with Calvin.
yeah, I would agree. We should disagree with him. We're supposed to disagree with him. And even if you didn't think that from the strip, Watterson comes out and says, I would suggest that it's not the medium, but the quality of perception and expression that determines the significance of art, which
Yeah,
actually sounds like, Ryan, a lot what you were saying a second ago, too. So it sounds like you and he would both agree. I would, too. And I'd say, well, yeah, but then it seems like this should apply to comic books too, shouldn't it?
right.
So to me, this seems like an inconsistency in the way he criticizes comic books in the other quote.
Yeah, I agree. I think saying that comic books as a blanket statement are incredibly stupid is I'm reiterating what I've said before, but it's a bit like saying TV shows are incredibly stupid. Well, which TV shows? Yeah, there are stupid TV shows, but that doesn't mean that
Mm-hmm.
all TV shows are stupid. And I'll also point out in episode 12, when we talked to Jenny Robb, she gave us a quote where he said he likes comic strips a little bit stupid. And in the 10th anniversary book, the T Rex in F-14 strip, he says, this is a dumb strip, but I had fun with it. So maybe being incredibly stupid isn't necessarily a bad thing, but also I don't think we can just make the blanket statement that comic books or TV shows or novels or comic strips or any medium is inherently stupid. It's what you do with that medium that determines whether it's stupid or not.
I would agree. I will say, as far as sort of the stupid versus whether that's okay or fun, since that quote about criticizing comic books was talking about gut splattering violence and being a psychopath, to me that counts a little bit against the idea that, oh, it's stupid but it's okay. To me, that particular part sounds more negative.
Yes, I would agree.
But
And I think there are certainly comic books that are stupid in a bad way. Uh,
yes.
I think there are also novels that are stupid in a bad way, looking at you, Twilight. But there are also good novels. So,
Yeah, no, I would agree. So I will say though, on the Tyrannosaurs and F-14 strip, and like, this is dumb, but I sure had fun with it. I guess two things about it. I mean, Hobbes kind of says that too, right? So Calvin's like, this is so cool. This is so stupid, which it is, but it's also totally awesome.
it
So
is. It is.
yeah, and it's funny to me too. Like, I find personally that strip gets funnier the older I get, which is the opposite of what I might have expected. Like, when I was first reading it as a kid, I found it kind of amusing. Oh, haha, he's imagining the Tyrannosaurs and F-14s. All right. The older I get, just that image, like talking about it, how cool it is, I find it funnier and funnier. So I don't know if that's other people's experience, but for me, maybe surprisingly, as I become more of an adult, like, it actually is funnier to me, this sort of childlike kind of stupid thing, than when I was a child.
Yeah, oh, it's a great strip, and I can absolutely see a kid pretending that a Tyrannosaur is flying an F-14 and pew, 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 and blowing up the Chasmosaurs.
Exactly. Yeah, they're unusually jittery as a result.
I would be too.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked a lot about comic books, we've talked about comic strips, we've talked about Calvin and Hobbes, sometimes just reading them with no issue, sometimes fighting about them. But anyway, this has been a lot of fun. I'd like to end with one final trivia question. So, as we mentioned, Watterson made up several comic book characters that exist within Calvin's world and that Calvin reads about. Can you name all of the made up comic characters who are mentioned or appear in the strip? We've already mentioned a few.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna get all of them. So now I know I need to include Super Toad. So we've got Super Toad
Okay.
in there. Obviously Captain Napalm. So
Yes. He
I
seems to
think,
be the leader of most of the other ones.
yeah, and I think maybe the Thermonuclear League of Liberty might consist of the other captains, of whom there is Captain Nitro, Captain Steroid, and I think maybe there's a Captain Mame,
Okay.
and then there's Amazon Girl and also Amazon Babe, and I'm not sure if they're the same character, but both are
All right.
mentioned.
Well done catching that. Okay.
Yeah. And there's Maggot Man. Um,
Yes.
okay, so I said Napalm, Nitro, Steroid, Mame, Amazon Girl, Amazon Babe, Super Toad, uh, Maggot Man. I feel like I'm missing something, but that's all I got.
Okay. That was actually very good. So, first, like I said a second ago, well done on catching that there's Amazon Girl and Amazon Babe. And you're right, this could be the same character, and maybe Watterson just, wasn't real precise about which. However, I will say in DC Comics, there's Wonder Woman and the younger Wonder Girl,
Oh yeah,
who are both Amazons too. So that may have been two separate characters. So that was a good catch. Maggot Man's hard to remember. Another good catch. I do think you're missing at least one though.
yeah,
So I think you got everybody except, and this, other than Super Toad, maybe this is probably the hardest. There's an arch villain named Deathmeister.
okay. That's ringing a bell. What is
So
his
this is,
deal?
I referred to the strip where he's in a second ago, but I didn't mention that he was in it. So I believe that's the one where Calvin buys 5 copies of it to as an investment for later.
Ah,
He's like, this is where they introduce the arch villain Deathmeister.
okay, okay, yeah. Oh, and I'm looking at the list. I also missed Nuke Man, which we did
That's
say
right.
before. I just forgot to put him in the
We
list
did
here.
mention him though.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I do want to congratulate you though. So you got pretty, with except for Nuke Man, but we didn't mention him before, so we'll count him. You pretty much got what seems to be the entire thermonuclear League of Liberty. So well done on that.
All
The
right.
one you missed Super Toad before, obviously, and then you missed the arch villain Deathmeister. But those are each only mentioned one time in the entirety of Calvin and Hobbes. So that's pretty good still.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good list.
Yeah. I was actually surprised too. I almost missed Deathmeister myself when I was like, I had the list for the question, then I was kind of going over something else. I'm like, oh wait, Deathmeister. Okay, so yeah,
Yeah. That was a tough one.
okay. And so, listeners, if you too, as we said before, would like to have trivia questions to try to stump one or both of us, remember to send them to us.
Oh, and we forgot to mention before. Deadline is August 31st.
That's right. So obviously, so we'll have enough time to make the episode.
Yeah.
But in any case, final thoughts about comic books in relation to Calvin and Hobbes.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think I've said most of what comes to mind. Just uh, the idea that I think it's interesting that on this point we seem to disagree with Bill Watterson's take. That's a rare
Mm-hmm.
thing for me. One time I mentioned something like this to my family, and they're like, "Ryan, are you feeling okay?" So, um, but yeah, so it's one of these rare instances where I feel like maybe he kind of got it wrong, even though I'm not really a comic books guy myself. I never really got into that. I don't necessarily think that they're inherently stupid. I think they can have value to them, and if you like them, they're worth enjoying. I'm against the gut splattering violence. I think that it can be taken too far, but I think Calvin is actually right in this case, that they can be uplifting good things. I'll end it there.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I also agree, like you said, it's like, yeah, it's pretty rare for us, especially doing this podcast, to be like, we think Watterson's wrong about this. I mean, usually we're kind of on the same page with him. But yeah, that's one case where, despite some legitimacy to his concerns, I do think in an overall sense he gets the point wrong. But that's okay. And either way, I think it's still a lot of fun how prominent comic books are here. I mean, this also rings very true to childhood to me as well. Like, I mean, so many kids,
Yeah.
especially little boys, grow up reading comic books, loving to hear about superheroes and what have you. Again, to go back to the Stan Lee quote, one of the only things a kid might buy with his own money is a comic book. So I think that's just one more thing that makes it feel like a real seeming kind of childhood. And again, another aspect of the sort of things that people imagine about when they're young, and sometimes even when they're not young anymore. But just another fun thing for this magical strip.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it does. I mean, yeah, you're right. It's just another great aspect that shows that Calvin, although Bill Watterson has said he's not a literal 6-year-old, in a lot of ways, he's a pretty accurate 6-year-old.
He is, which other people have observed on is why part of why the strip's so popular. I mean, I think we've probably talked about this before too, but I want to say maybe it was Pat Oliphant in one of the sort of intros to, I think, the second book, saying
Hmm.
like, here's someone who gets childhood right. It's
Yeah.
not some distorted version. It's like, yeah, this feels real. This is the kind of thing that a child does.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but on that note, this has been a lot of fun. So, readers, well, yes, readers of comic books and Calvin and Hobbes, and listeners of this podcast, you can always email us at magiccandh@proton.me. We would love to hear from you, your thoughts about comic books or other things about the strip. And like we said, any potential trivia questions that you might have for Ryan or for myself.
Yeah. And as always, this podcast is ad free. We will never put ads on it. It's never going to be behind any sort of paywall. We just want everyone to be able to come join with us and celebrate Calvin and Hobbes and have fun talking about comic books and superheroes and everything else that Calvin and Hobbes enjoy and bring joy to us about.
Exactly. So, come along with us. Let's go exploring.
You've been listening to The Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. We'll be releasing 40 episodes all throughout the year, from November 18th, 2025 to November 18th, 2026, to celebrate the 40th anniversary. Our intro and outro music is Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, referenced in the Calvin and Hobbes strip published on October 8, 1986. This rendition was performed by the Skidmore College Orchestra and made available under a Creative Commons license on museopen.com. We hope you'll join us next episode for more fun.